In the final video for this module, I will discuss academic sources. I will also discuss trustworthy versus untrustworthy sources more generally, including the use of generative artificial intelligence as a tool for gathering information. Throughout this module, we've been discussing how psychologists conduct research as part of the scientific process. An important final step in this process is that after the study has been conducted, the researchers need to make these findings available to the broader scientific community. In fact, it was Isaac Newton who was famous for saying, "If I have seen farther, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." By this, he meant that his breakthrough discoveries about gravity were not totally original. Other scientific thinkers had gone before Newton and laid the groundwork for his ideas. Therefore, it's important that the scientific community is aware of what work has already been done on a topic so that they can build effectively on prior knowledge. The main way that researchers share their findings with the scientific community is through the academic publication process. The first step in this process is for the researcher to write up a manuscript that contains a detailed summary of the research that was done and what was found. Each discipline has their own norms about how to format these manuscripts, but generally all scientific manuscripts will include the same four major components: a background or introduction section that summarizes what is already known about a topic and how the current research will try to extend that knowledge, a methods section that summarizes how the data were collected, a results section that summarizes how the data were statistically analyzed, and a discussion or conclusion section that summarizes the overall findings and their importance. If you find you read a lot of academic articles for other classes, I have a quick pro tip for you. The results section usually has quite a lot of technical jargon, so if you don't already have a strong stats background, this section can sometimes be particularly difficult to understand. However, the first paragraph of the discussion section will usually restate these results in plain language. Most articles will also have an abstract at the very beginning, which is basically a condensed version of the entire article into just a couple hundred words or so. You can use the abstract as a way to quickly judge if it is worth going on to read the entire article. However, because abstracts are so short, a lot of important details are left out, so they should never be used as a substitute for reading the article itself. A quick academic rule of thumb: don't cite an article in your own research if you didn't read the whole thing. After writing up the manuscript, the researcher will then submit it to an academic journal. An academic journal is a publication whose sole purpose is to publish and disseminate academic research. In the past, these journals used to be physically printed, but today, most of them exist primarily online. There are many different academic journals. The field of psychology alone has dozens. Each journal has slightly different topics that it focuses on. For example, each subdiscipline of psychology that we discussed in Module 1.2 has at least one journal, if not several, that primarily focus on publishing research for just that topic area. Some academic journals are also known for being more difficult to publish in because they have higher standards. All legitimate academic journals, however, do require that manuscripts go through something called a peer review process before being published, and this process is intended to act as a kind of quality control check. Specifically, after submitting the manuscript to a journal, the editor of the journal will send the manuscript out to 2 or 3 other scientists to read and critique. These scientists are usually experts in the same topic area as the study in question. For example, articles submitted to the Journal of Personality Research would likely be reviewed by other personality psychologists. These experts or peer reviewers read the manuscript and evaluate the quality of the work. For example, they might ask questions like, was the study well done? How large was the sample and was it representative? Were the statistical analyses appropriate? And how novel or groundbreaking are the findings? They then send these reviews back to the journal editor, who makes the final determination about whether the manuscript merits publication in the journal. You might be surprised to learn that the vast majority of manuscripts submitted for publication are actually rejected. And even manuscripts that are accepted typically go through a lengthy revise and resubmit process where the original study authors make requested changes that are intended to improve the manuscript before it is published. This whole process can take anywhere from a couple of months to even sometimes a year or more. You might have noticed that I said earlier all legitimate academic journals go through this peer review process. Unfortunately, there are some illegitimate journals, usually called predatory journals, that try to pass themselves off as real journals, but are really just fraudulent schemes to try to make money. They often do this by charging authors to publish in the journal. A real academic journal never does this. Because these predatory journals make money for each article that they publish, they are incentivized to publish a lot. So predatory journals don't check articles for quality using the same standard peer review process. Instead, they publish just about anything, including studies that are very poor quality. A real academic journal, in contrast, has much higher quality standards, and as a result, it publishes only a small portion of the submissions it receives. In fact, some of the most prestigious academic journals have a rejection rate of over 90%. That is, they accept fewer than 10% of their submissions. In this way, the peer review process is intended to work as a kind of quality control for academic research. In theory, only the most well-done studies should make it into academic journals for publication. In practice, of course, the peer review process is not perfect, and it does have its critics. However, peer review is currently the best system we have, and it generally ensures that poorly done studies are not published, at least in real journals, that is. So if you want to do background research on a particular topic, how can you find appropriate academic sources? By far, the easiest is through a resource called Google Scholar. Google Scholar works a bit like regular Google, but it only returns academic sources. If you want to find information on a topic, you can just type it into the search box like you would in a normal Google search. For example, in this screenshot, you can see I've searched for the topic violent video games and aggression, and you can see the first 3 search results that come up. The title of the article is listed in blue, and the authors are listed underneath in green. If I were to click on the links here on the right, I could access the full text of the article. You do have to be careful though, because Google Scholar can also sometimes return results from predatory journals too. If you're uncertain about whether an article was published in a predatory journal, you can try reaching out to an expert in the field or someone from the university libraries. Another way to find academic articles from only legitimate journals is to use an academic database such as PsycInfo or PubMed. Instead of scraping the entire internet, a database has a known finite number of entries, and you can query the database to find entries that match your research question. However, databases usually have specific conventions about making a search query, so you can't just type a question into PsycInfo or PubMed like you would in a Google search. Instead, you have to carefully craft appropriate keywords to locate the articles of interest. The university libraries is a great resource that can help you with this if you'd like to learn more. Lastly, it's also important to note that most academic articles usually exist behind a paywall, meaning that people have to pay to read it, just like a newspaper that charges for subscriptions. Universities usually pay large subscription fees to these journals so that everyone affiliated with the institution can access it. So, as a student at Virginia Tech, you have access to many academic journal articles for free that you would not otherwise have access to. You can usually access these articles either through the VT Library's homepage or through Google Scholar when using campus Wi-Fi. I also recommend setting up your Google Scholar account to link with the Virginia Tech libraries. When you do, you'll see this Get vText link pop up in your search, which allows you to access the articles that Virginia Tech pays for even when you're off campus. And even if Virginia Tech doesn't pay for an article that you want access to, you can still get it for free through something called the Interlibrary Loan Program, or ILLIAD. To use this, you'll need to set up an account, and then you can request articles that you want, and the turnaround is usually about 1 to 3 days to receive an electronic copy of an article. Again, if you want more information about this tool, you can reach out to the university libraries for help. In addition to academic journal publications, there are also what we call popular press articles. These are the kinds of articles you might find in newspapers or magazines, such as Psychology Today. While both academic journal articles and popular press articles might share information about novel scientific findings, they do so in very different ways. Academic articles are written by scientists who conduct original research on a particular topic. Although scientists will sometimes write popular press articles too, more often popular press articles are written by journalists who are not experts on a given topic. Academic and popular press articles also have different purposes and are written for different audiences. Whereas academic articles are intended to advance new knowledge within a small scientific community, popular press articles are intended to broadly share scientific findings that may be of interest to the general public. For these reasons, academic and popular press articles have some important differences. First, academic articles tend to be longer, and they contain a lot of technical information and scientific jargon, sometimes making them difficult to understand if you're not an expert on that topic. They also usually follow strict formatting rules, so most academic journal articles will look pretty similar at first glance. In contrast, popular press articles are written for a more general audience. They are usually much shorter than academic articles, and they are also usually written in more everyday language rather than containing a lot of jargon. They may also contain ads and colorful images designed to grab readers' attention. Lastly, whereas academic articles are evaluated and critiqued by experts through the peer review process, popular press articles are not. Whereas academic articles are concerned with scientific accuracy, popular press articles are concerned with grabbing and keeping a reader's attention. For this reason, popular press articles about psychology or any scientific topic in general can sometimes lack nuance or make sweeping, overgeneralized claims. So it's important to approach popular press articles with a bit of caution. Often, it's also good practice to actually look up the original academic article itself and see if the findings from the study match the claims being made. For an interesting example of both predatory journals and the potential inaccuracy of some popular press articles, you can check out the video about the fake chocolate study in the supplemental videos on Canvas. Let's do a quick application practice question now together. Can you tell which of these two sources is an academic versus a popular press article? The answer is the one on the left is a popular press article published in the online magazine Psychology Today. If you were to look up the full article, you'd see that it's pretty short and written in everyday terms. And it also has colorful pictures and advertisements, and it has a short references section at the end with only 3 references. It does look like this particular article was written by an expert with a PhD, and she seems to be talking about research that she herself has conducted. However, this article hasn't been through the scientific peer review process, so even though the author is talking about research that she has conducted, the claims she is making based on that research have not been evaluated or critiqued by other experts, so you should take it with a grain of salt. The article on the right is published in an academic journal. You can see here just a screenshot of the abstract, which is broken down into mini versions of each section of the article. If you were to read the whole thing, you would see it is 10 pages long, much longer than the short webpage article. And the last couple of pages are also filled with references, another big clue that this is an academic work and not a popular press article. In addition to making a distinction about academic versus non-academic sources, I'd also like to make a distinction about sources that are more or less trustworthy in general. In previous eras in human history, information was difficult to access. Information had to be physically recorded, so it couldn't be easily or quickly transported. Moreover, much of the human population was illiterate. With the invention of the printing press in the mid-1400s, information was able to be spread much more quickly. Some 500-odd years later, the advent of the internet and the personal computer ushered in an even more rapid shift in the accessibility of information. Now, the problem isn't so much that we can't get information, but rather that we have too much of it. Type almost anything into Google and you'll find links to dozens, if not hundreds of articles on that topic. However, not all of this information is of equal quality. For example, if you wanted to find medical information about muscular dystrophy, you might be more likely to trust information from places like WebMD or a professional doctor, whereas you might be rightly skeptical of claims made by a TikTok influencer with no medical degree and no personal knowledge of the disease. It's important to note that very few sources are either completely trustworthy or completely untrustworthy. Rather, many sources exist on a spectrum. Some information may be mostly accurate, but lacks some nuance. Other sources may be sensationalized and contain a grain of truth along with a lot of other claims that are either unproven or factually incorrect. Finally, you should know that some information is downright intended to deceive you. For example, scams are becoming ever more prevalent, and I'm ashamed to admit I've fallen for a couple before. It's also important to note that not all academic sources are automatically trustworthy, and likewise not all non-academic sources are automatically less trustworthy. First, while most academic sources are considered trustworthy because they are written by experts and have been through the peer review process, we also have to keep in mind some of the limits of the scientific method that we discussed in the first video in this module. There have also been some unfortunate instances of scientific researchers who have tried to publish fraudulent data which later had to be retracted, which means that the academic journal essentially revoked its initial publication of the article. On the other hand, some non-academic sources may still be considered relatively trustworthy, such as reports from government agencies or nonprofit institutions. Unfortunately, there is no single hard and fast rule about what makes a particular source be trustworthy or untrustworthy. That's part of what makes it so tricky. However, there are some steps we can take to arm ourselves against misinformation. One recent method developed by Mike Caulfield is called the SIFT method, which stands for stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims and quotes to their original context. The first step in this process is simply to stop. It's so easy to get caught up in a sensational claim or a flashy offer that seems too good to be true. However, when we make decisions quickly, we tend to make poor ones. So it's always good to slow down and think before you click buy or reshare on your newsfeed. You might be falling for a scam or spreading misinformation to others. After you stop, it's time to dig a little bit deeper into that claim, and you can do this in a few different ways. First, it's always good practice to double check the source of the information itself. What can you find about the author or website creators? Do they have authority in this area? What is their mission? Do they have vested interests, and so would their assessment therefore be biased? It's also good to try to find additional information beyond just a single source, and this is called lateral reading, that is, finding other sources that discuss the same topic. What other information can you find about this claim? Does it generally corroborate the original claim or refute it? And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when an article references an academic study or a quote from an expert, it's always good practice to try to locate the original source of that information. Was the claim or quote fairly represented? Is information being taken out of context or cherry-picked to support an agenda? Finally, remember that almost no source is 100% trustworthy on its own. To get the best, most complete information, you'll likely need to put in the effort of finding multiple sources that represent various perspectives. As we discuss trustworthy versus untrustworthy sources of information, I'd also like to take a moment to talk about generative AI. Perhaps even more so than the printing press and the invention of the internet, generative AI has increased our accessibility to information. At the same time, however, we also have to be aware that just because generative AI can quickly give us an answer, it doesn't mean that that answer is good or trustworthy. To understand why, it's important to remember what exactly the AI algorithm is doing. Generative AI tools are basically very sophisticated prediction machines. After training the algorithm on millions of pieces of data, such as text and images, the AI algorithm essentially learns what is expected in certain situations. So when you type a question into ChatGPT, for instance, the algorithm is basically predicting a result based on its exposure to millions and millions of previous examples of writing. The question you type and the output you receive are also used to continue training and refining the algorithm. While the responses in ChatGPT can sometimes wow us with how much they sound like real human writing, this actually shouldn't be too surprising, given that it was human writing they were trained on in the first place. Moreover, there are two major issues here we need to be aware of. First, the algorithm is predicting, not fact-checking, so its output can sometimes be flat out wrong. Specifically, AI hallucinations are the term given for when the algorithm confidently produces false or nonsensical results, such as this example from 2020 when ChatGPT was asked, "What is the world record for crossing the English Channel entirely on foot?" As you can see, the chatbot gives a very long, confident-sounding answer, even though this is a completely nonsensical question because the English Channel is a waterway and so no one has ever crossed it on foot. Sometimes AI hallucinations can be quite funny and obviously wrong, like this one, and these types of hallucinations were certainly more common in the early years. Since then, the algorithms have gotten a little bit better, but they're still not perfect. That's why it's important to always be on alert and to fact-check AI output, even if it seems reasonable to you at first glance. Sometimes if you just dig a little bit deeper or check with an expert, you'll find that the output is incorrect, or at the very least incomplete. A second related issue has to do with how the AI algorithm is being trained in the first place. If the input images or text that the AI was trained on were bad, so to speak, then the output will be bad too. This is commonly referred to as garbage in, garbage out. Similarly, if the AI is overly relying on just one type of source, say sources from the US, then the output can be biased and fail to consider alternate evidence or perspectives. So again, human beings need to be thoughtful consumers of AI output rather than just taking it at face value. In addition to these concerns with information quality, I also want to end by quickly noting a couple other issues that you may want to consider as you personally evaluate whether and how to use AI in your own life. The first concern has to do with something that is particularly relevant for all college students: critical thinking skills. Recent studies have shown that relying on AI to simply give you the answer decreases your capacity for deep critical thought. And while that might not seem like a big deal to you now, you could find it becomes a major issue when you try to enter the workforce. That's because AI algorithms are increasingly able to perform a number of entry-level jobs more efficiently than most humans. In fact, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, computer programming was considered a relatively safe career option with good pay and high demand. Today, however, many computer programming graduates are having trouble finding entry-level work. While the reasons for this are likely varied, the replacement of these types of jobs with AI is a leading possible culprit. As you look to transition into the workplace, it's very likely that you will need to know not just how to use the AI to look up an answer, but also how to edit, fact-check, and improve upon its output. And that requires the capacity for original, creative thought, which is something you can only cultivate through the hard work of practice. Before you fall into the habit of quickly turning to AI to solve a problem for you, I would really highly encourage you to go through the hard work of trying to solve it yourself first, even if that means you have to endure making a couple of mistakes along the way. Mistakes and feedback are how you learn. You can't become an expert in anything without making some mistakes first. Lastly, I am personally alarmed by the increasing stories of AI addiction and AI-induced psychological distress. There have now been multiple reports of chatbots exacerbating serious mental health conditions such as psychosis and severe depression. Please do not use AI as a replacement for a human therapist or for human interaction in general. We were made to be social creatures, and I personally think that AI chatbots will never be able to replace that. In this video, we covered academic sources as well as trustworthy information in general. For the exam, you should be able to define academic journal article and explain how it is different from a popular press article, describe the peer review process and explain how it acts as a quality control for academic journals, define predatory journal and explain how it is different from a real academic journal, discuss the SIFT method and explain how it can be used to identify and weed out misinformation, and explain why AI output is not always a trustworthy source of information.